It was the sort of occasion for which Flaxborough prided itself, the annual floral and produce exhibition in the town hall assembly rooms, where geraniums glowed like disciplined soldiers in serried ranks, and marrows reclined on trestle tables with the air of corpulent aldermen. The townsfolk, accustomed to mild triumphs in the fields of rhubarb, chrysanthemums and sponge cake, came as much for the gossip as the judging. At precisely 3 o'clock, as ladies in hats with feathers inspected preserves, the first murmur of disturbance arose. Mrs. Withers, a formidable woman of staunch moral opinion and even stiffer corsetry, had been asked to present her jar of homemade marmalade for judging in the citrus preserves category. She lifted the gingham cover, smoothed the ribbon with a hand reverent as a churchwarden's, and placed the jar on the table with a final nod of self-congratulation. A moment later, Judge Miss Empson, who had never before been known to display excitement in public, gasped in such a theatrical manner that every nearby exhibitor and several from adjoining stalls swung round at once. The cause of this gasp was swiftly apparent. Instead of the expected amber translucence of Seville oranges suspended in sugary amber, the jar contained something else entirely, a dark and viscous substance, faintly glistening, in which floated not peel, but what appeared horrifyingly to be a human finger. It was small, possibly belonging to a child or a delicately proportioned adult, and of a pallor that suggested no life had lately coursed through it. The nail was neatly trimmed, which the more attentive noted with a kind of sickened admiration. For several seconds the assembly rooms held a silence usually only achieved by death, or a vicar's pause before naming a notorious benefactor. Then came the ripple of voices, ladies exclaiming, "Good heavens!" men attempting to sound knowledgeable about anatomical features, and one elderly retired chemist asserting in a thin but confident voice that it must be a pickled parsnip root. No one believed him. The Reverend Kinsey, present in his capacity as a horticultural enthusiast, pressed a handkerchief to his lips and muttered something about the abominations of this age. Meanwhile, Mrs. Withers, whose marmalade was innocent of anything more sinister than slightly overboiled rind, had collapsed into a chair and was protesting in gasps and wheezes that the jar was not hers at all. She swore her own was filled with perfectly respectable fruit, and that someone had switched it. At this point, the mayor, a florid man who had lately adopted the habit of speaking in what he imagined were statesmanlike tones, declared the matter a grave and deplorable intrusion upon civic celebration. He proposed the immediate summoning of the police, which was greeted with murmured assent and no small thrill. It was not every year that the flower show provided material for the constabulary. Thus it was that Inspector Purbright, whose preference for quiet paperwork was known only to himself, received the call. By the time he entered the assembly rooms, calm, polite, unobtrusively, surveying the crowd, the marmalade jar had been placed beneath an upturned cake dome, as though the genteel glass cover might contain its indecency. Town gossip was already fermenting with more efficiency than yeast in a prize-winning loaf. Purbright listened. He asked no immediate questions. He noted Mrs. Withers's indignation, the mayor's self-importance, Miss Empson's continued tremors of genteel outrage, and the faintly delighted curiosity in every eye that turned his way. He leaned slightly over the table, observed the grisly content through the glass, and said in the mildest of tones, "Well, it does seem an unusual sort of entry." The laughter that followed, half nervous, half genuinely appreciative of the inspector's deadpan, allowed the room to breathe again. But the fact remained, in the heart of Flaxborough's most respectable event, a jar of marmalade had become an exhibit of something very much like murder. Word spread from the town hall with the eagerness of a cat released into a room full of cream jugs. Within 20 minutes of Inspector Purbright's quiet inspection of the marmalade jar, Every tea shop, drapery counter, and tobacconist's till in Flaxborough had acquired its own version of events, each telling improved upon the last like a sermon polished by successive vicars. By the time the milk train from Norcaster pulled in at 4:30, passengers were greeted not with the usual questions about their health, but with hushed exclamations concerning that finger in the jam. The cause of this metamorphosis of gossip was, as always, a small cluster of citizens blessed with both time and lungs. Chief among them was Miss Teatley, a retired schoolmistress who considered accuracy a poor substitute for urgency. She sat enthroned in her customary window seat at the Imperial Café, dispensing to a ring of gratified listeners a version of events in which the jar had been found, not at the flower show but on the mayor's own tea-table, and in which the severed digit belonged to a vanished maidservant of foreign origin. This story, embroidered with little sighs of pity and dark allusions to continental practices, was solemnly noted down by a young reporter from the Flaxborough Citizen, who knew better than to challenge the source of such a profitable tale. At the other end of town, Mrs. Jubb, whose husband operated the local taxi fleet, entertained a gathering outside her front gate with the assertion that the marmalade had been prepared by none other than the vicar's wife, and that the finger was merely the beginning of a collection found distributed among various preserves. This theory drew gasps and murmurs, though none could explain how or why Mrs. Kinsey might have embarked on such a peculiar pastime. Meanwhile, Purbright allowed the matter to ferment in its natural course. After all, gossip was to Flaxborough what smoke is to a chimney, the most efficient means of gauging what lay smouldering within. The inspector's own movements remained leisurely. He accepted a modest cup of tea from the trembling Miss Empson, listened to Mrs. Withers's outraged catalogue of grievances, chief among them the defamation of her marmalade, and allowed the mayor to issue him a lecture on the blow to civic dignity. He asked no penetrating questions, yet observed closely how each speaker seized upon the incident as a stage upon which to exhibit their particular anxieties or vanities. By the next morning, the Citizen carried a front-page headline: "Macabre Marmalade Mystifies Flaxborough." The accompanying article made up for in adjectives what it lacked in facts. It hinted that a crime of international significance might have touched their quiet borough, suggesting connections to espionage, smuggling, and a notorious East End gang. Nowhere did it mention the word finger, for the editor considered such indelicacy unfit for his readership. Instead, the paper chose the phrase gruesome object, which permitted a reader's imagination to do far worse. Over breakfast, Purbright read the article with the faintest of smiles. He folded the paper neatly, placed it aside, and set out for the police station. Sergeant Love, already alight with excitement, greeted him with, "Morning, sir. The whole town's abuzz. They say it's witchcraft, or foreign, which comes to the same thing." "Indeed," murmured Purbright, settling his hat on the rack. "Do we know anything yet about the finger itself?" Love looked slightly crestfallen. "Well, sir, Dr. Hilliard's had a look. Says it's genuine enough. Humans. Male, he thinks. Cut clean. Not torn. Not fresh. Mind it's been preserved somehow. He reckons it might have been pickled before it found its way into the marmalade." The inspector raised his brows slightly, like a man presented with an unusual, but not wholly unexpected flavour at luncheon. "Preserved," he repeated. That would seem to suggest intent, wouldn't it? One does not usually store such articles alongside last summer's gooseberries. Love chuckled nervously, then attempted seriousness. "Shall I start checking missing persons, sir? Fingers particularly?" "That may be a trifle ambitious," said Purbright. "Let us begin more locally. Who had the opportunity to interfere with Mrs. Withers's entry, and who might have wished to embarrass her?" The sergeant nodded, already envisaging a list of names that would stretch from the town hall committee to the Withers' next-door neighbour. Plenty who can't stand her, sir. She's a tartar. Remember the business with the library fund? Put the whole town in bad odour with the county council. Precisely, said Purbright mildly. A woman of such civic vigour invites both admiration and resentment. Let us not be surprised if one sentiment outweighs the other. By noon, the inspector took a walk along High Street, his progress accompanied by subtle nods, whispers, and the occasional bold inquiry. He responded with a pleasant good afternoon to each, never supplying the morsel of detail his interlocutors longed for. At the draper's, 2 assistants dropped pins in their eagerness to overhear. At the post office, a clerk pretended to miscount stamps in order to keep within earshot. Purbright remained bland, yet he was registering much. The eagerness, the relish, the undercurrent of fear. That evening, as the town settled into its comfortable pattern of suppers and wireless sets, small knots of conversation still revolved around the marmalade jar. Some argued that the whole thing must be a prank, devised by mischievous students. Others preferred the darker view that a murder had occurred, and that Flaxborough's tranquillity was fatally pierced. Few cared much for Mrs. Withers's protests of innocence. Indeed, some found them suspiciously emphatic. Purbright, seated in his study with a pipe he seldom lit, considered none of these conclusions final. He knew too well the town's gift for self-invention. A finger in a jar of marmalade was extraordinary enough, yet the real matter, he suspected, lay less in what had been discovered than in the passions it had stirred. People revealed themselves most clearly when allowed to gossip unchecked. He leaned back, allowing the last light of day to fade across the street outside, and thought with faint amusement that tomorrow's chatter would supply him with more than half his inquiries. After all, a town that cherished its secrets so dearly was often the most careless in how it concealed them. By the following morning, Inspector Purbright judged that the town had enjoyed sufficient rehearsal of its theories to make interviews productive. People, after all, spoke more freely once they had convinced themselves of the correctness of their own inventions. He began with Mrs. Withers, whose indignation remained untempered by the passage of a night, and who received him in a sitting-room dominated by an aspidistra and a photograph of her late husband in the uniform of the Home Guard. "I'll have you know, Inspector," she began, before he had settled into the hard horsehair chair she indicated, "that I have always prided myself on the cleanliness of my kitchen. Nothing improper has ever been allowed into my preserves. To suggest otherwise is malicious." Her voice cracked with outrage, though beneath it lingered a note of satisfaction at the attention she commanded. Purbright nodded gently. "I can quite understand your distress, Mrs. Withers. No one imagines you to be responsible. But perhaps you noticed anything unusual about the table where your jar was set?" She sniffed, dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief, and recounted at length the bustle of exhibitors jostling for space. She remembered, she said, that Mrs. Roper, the butcher's wife, had been seen, hovering near the preserves, making little clucking noises that could only have been intended to disparage her own offering. Mrs. Withers also believed that Councillor Harbottle had looked upon her entry with what she described as a calculating smirk. Purbright listened without comment, though he noted that Mrs. Withers had mentioned a dozen suspects in as many minutes, each selected from among those she had quarrelled with in some parish matter or other. He rose at last, thanked her for her helpfulness, and promised that the police would pursue every clue. Her expression as she accompanied him to the door betrayed both indignation and pride. Indignation that she should be so wronged, pride that the inspector himself had called at her home. Next, he visited Miss Empson, the spinster judge of preserves, whose shriek had set the whole affair in motion. She lived in a trim terraced house, smelling faintly of lavender polish, and boiled cabbage. Her recounting of the incident was both precise and tremulous, as though she had replayed it in her mind so often that it had acquired the character of a melodrama. She insisted that the jar could not possibly have been Mrs. Withers's, for she had inspected each exhibit personally that morning and recalled distinctly the colour and consistency of the marmalade before judging began. The finger, she claimed, had appeared only later, as though by some infernal conjuring trick. "And no one, you think, might have approached the table unobserved?" Purbright asked politely. "Oh, Inspector, there was such a press of people, ladies with parasols, men with their prizes of onions and turnips. It was most difficult to keep one's eyes everywhere at once. Still, I would not be surprised if someone took advantage of the commotion." She lowered her voice to a confidential whisper. "Mrs. Withers is not well liked, you know. Always lecturing, always correcting. Why, only last week she took the vicar to task about the hymn numbers being out of sequence. In church, too. Purbright allowed her to unburden herself of further grievances until she was quite exhausted. He left her with a mild assurance that the police would be discreet and return to the station with a notebook considerably fatter, but not, in his view, greatly more enlightening. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, had been gathering statements from various committee members. He reported that Councillor Harbottle had indeed loitered near the preserves table, ostensibly to adjust a vase of dahlias, and that Mrs. Roper had been heard to mutter something unflattering about Mrs. Withers's jam-making. The sergeant relayed these findings with relish, as though already convinced that one of the two must be guilty. Purbright, however, regarded the matter with caution. He asked instead about the jar itself, whether anyone had confirmed that it belonged to Mrs. Withers. Love admitted that it had been impossible to say with certainty. The jars were nearly identical, distinguished only by ribbons and labels easily switched. Mrs. Withers claimed her true entry had vanished, and none could prove otherwise. "Then we must consider," Purbright said, "that the jar with the finger was placed deliberately and that Mrs. Withers's original preserve has been removed. If so, we have here not merely a prank, but an act requiring preparation." In the afternoon, Purbright paid a visit to Dr. Hilliard, who had agreed to examine the finger more closely. The physician, a brisk man inclined to sarcasm, displayed the object in a small jar of formalin, where it floated with an air of resigned indignity. "Well, Inspector," said Hilliard, "your curiosity is satisfied. Male, middle-aged, I'd say. Severed cleanly some weeks ago. I can't tell you whose finger it is, unless you've got a line of townsfolk willing to submit their hands for inspection." He smirked, evidently amused by his own wit. "As for how it came to be pickled, I'd wager in spirit or brine. Someone took trouble over it." Purbright studied the specimen without betraying distaste. So it was prepared for keeping. Not the work of a moment, certainly not. Whoever did it knew a little about preservation, not professional perhaps, but competent enough. As he left the surgery, Purbright reflected that the finger's preservation meant intention stretched back weeks, if not months. This was not a spur-of-the-moment joke. Someone had nursed the idea, then chosen the town's most public, most respectable event to unveil it. Such timing suggested a motive beyond mischief, some grievance requiring spectacle. That evening, Purbright returned home to the station house lodgings. He sat at his desk, listening faintly to the wireless in the downstairs common room, where Sergeant Love chuckled at a comedy program. The inspector spread his notes, read them through, and then closed the book. What struck him most was not the finger itself, but the relish with which the town embraced the scandal. Everyone had an interpretation, each interpretation coloured by petty animosity or vanity. Yet hidden among the embellishments must lie the plain truth. It was, he thought, like trying to glimpse a church spire through a fog of chimney smoke, obscured, distorted, but still there. He drew a line beneath his notes and wrote in his neat hand, "Jar not Withers's, preserves switched, who had access, who gains by humiliation." He tapped the pen thoughtfully, then added, "Finger, preserved weeks, personal malice, not accident." Folding the notebook, he rose, extinguished the lamp, and allowed the town to sleep upon its scandal. For Purbright knew that the longer people talked, the more they revealed not always about the crime, but about themselves. And sometimes that was the more useful evidence. By midweek, the council chamber resembled less a forum for civic administration than a parlour devoted to speculation. Councillor Harbottle, stout, ruddy, and fortified by his own sense of indispensability, presided with the solemnity of a judge, but the caution of a man who had already decided where blame should fall. To his mind, the incident at the flower show could not be dismissed as a prank. It was, he declared to anyone willing to listen, a deliberate act of sabotage by a person of malicious character, and who better to occupy that role than Mrs. Withers herself? The theory had obvious attractions. Mrs. Withers's quarrels with practically every organisation in Flaxborough were a matter of long record. Her disputes with the Library Committee, her denunciations of the Women's Guild over inadequate hymnals, her repeated challenges to the council about litter in side streets. Harbottle had little difficulty presenting her as an attention-seeker capable of staging her own humiliation merely to ensure the town revolved around her. It was, he suggested with solemn nods, a trick gone wrong. By the time Inspector Purbright attended the council session, Harbottle's opinion had gained sufficient ground to pass for consensus. Several councillors murmured agreement, and even the mayor, though less certain, allowed himself to remark that Mrs. Withers did rather court controversy. Purbright, sitting unobtrusively near the back, listened without betraying approval or dissent. He allowed Harbottle to air his certainty and allowed others to nod and mutter before he rose quietly at the mayor's invitation to comment. He began in his mildest voice, "It is certainly convenient to suppose that Mrs. Withers contrived this herself. Yet it would be a curious choice, would it not? To destroy her own marmalade and invite scandal upon her household merely for the satisfaction of an argument?" The councillors stirred. Harbottle coughed and coloured. Purbright continued, "We must not confuse irritation with guilt. That a woman makes herself disagreeable does not mean she dismembers her neighbours." His words, spoken with calm reason, produced a ripple of uneasy laughter, though Harbottle's expression darkened as if he suspected mockery. Still, the notion of Mrs. Withers's complicity persisted in town talk. In the snug of the King's Arms, tradesmen nodded sagely over pints and declared the woman capable of anything. At the milliner's, customers whispered that she had always had a look about her. Suspicion, once planted, grew easily in Flaxborough soil. Sergeant Love, too, inclined towards the convenient view. As he and Purbright walked back from the council chamber, he ventured, "You must admit, sir, it'd be just like her. She likes to make a scene, and what bigger scene than putting a finger in her own jar?" "True," said Purbright, "but let us reflect. To do so she must first acquire the finger, not the easiest of errands." Love frowned, realizing the awkwardness. "Yes, can't just pop into the butcher's and ask for one of those." He brightened after a moment. "But she might know somebody, some medical chap, or even the undertaker. Could have got it from there." Purbright gave him a look of quiet amusement. "You have a talent, Sergeant, for discovering possibilities, but our work requires probabilities. Do you really imagine Mrs. Withers skulking about inquiring for body parts?" Love muttered. "Perhaps not." But his tone betrayed reluctance to abandon the theory. After all, the neatness of having a culprit ready to hand was attractive in a world where most problems resisted such convenient answers. Later that afternoon, Purbright returned once more to Mrs. Withers's house. He found her in the midst of writing an indignant letter to the citizen, which she read aloud in tones trembling with righteousness. The letter described in great detail her affront at being considered suspect, her years of service to civic causes, and her determination to sue for slander any person repeating such calumnies. "I assure you, Inspector," she declared, setting down her pen with a flourish, "I have never so much as touched a dead person, let alone put one in my marmalade, and I deeply resent that Councillor Harbottle should suggest otherwise." Purbright reassured her with grave courtesy, and, noting the genuine distress behind her bluster, left with the strong impression that though Mrs. Withers could poison many an afternoon with her tongue, she was unlikely to poison the town with dismembered anatomy. The evening brought further developments. Dr. Hilliard telephoned to report that the finger bore faint traces of some adhesive plaster evidence, perhaps, that it had once been bound as an injury before amputation. "Surgical, I'd say," he told the inspector. "Whoever lost it did so under a doctor's knife, not in a brawl." This detail, modest though it was, deepened Purbright's conviction that the finger's presence in a preserved jar owed nothing to Mrs. Withers's domestic habit. Rather, it belonged to some prior hidden story, an operation, a patient, a medical disposal gone astray. Someone, somewhere, had retained the finger for a reason, and that reason had been brought forward now in an act of deliberate malice. Yet even as he mulled these possibilities, the town's appetite for scandal raced ahead of him. The common verdict by nightfall was that Mrs. Withers was guilty of something, even if no one could agree precisely on what. She had enemies enough for suspicion to cling to her like a burr, and many preferred not to examine the absurdity too closely. Purbright, however, preferred patience to premature certainty. He knew that in Flaxborough the first obvious suspect was rarely the true one. Guilt, like marmalade, required long simmering before its flavour revealed itself fully. For the moment he allowed the town its convenient scapegoat, even as he turned his thoughts quietly to others who might have gained more from the spectacle. Inspector Purbright was not given to sudden inspiration. He preferred instead the slow accretion of details, each seemingly minor until, in sufficient number, they became too heavy to ignore. It was therefore typical that the first crack in the simple theory of Mrs. Withers's guilt came not from a revelation in the council chamber, nor from medical science, but from a remark made over a pot of weak tea in the police canteen. Constable Parkinson, a young man whose appetite was more reliable than his intellect, observed between mouthfuls of jam sponge that he had noticed something peculiar at the show. Several jars of preserves, including Mrs. Withers's, had been labelled not in the exhibitor's usual hand, but in a neat, identical script. This detail, delivered with the casual air of a man who had not considered its importance, made Purbright set down his cup. "Identical, you say?" he asked, in that quiet way of his, which made men repeat themselves more carefully. "Yes, sir," Parkinson said eagerly. "The labels were all written the same way, almost like they'd been copied out. I remember because one jar of chutney belonged to my aunt, and she always writes in great, sprawling letters. But at the show, her label looked neat as a school exercise. She said she hadn't done it." The inspector thanked him, made no further comment, and returned to his office where Sergeant Love was at work, frowning over lists of possible suspects. Purbright mentioned the matter lightly, as though it were only an oddity. Love responded with a shrug. "Probably the committee wrote them out again to make things tidy. Miss Empson's fussy that way." "Perhaps," Purbright murmured, but he made a note all the same. If the labels had indeed been rewritten, then the opportunity to substitute one jar for another had been made easier. A new label was like a mask. Behind it, almost anything might lurk. Later that day, he walked to the assembly rooms to speak with the caretaker, Mr. Craggs, a lean man of melancholy appearance who claimed to have seen everything worth seeing in Flaxborough twice already, and remained unimpressed by all of it. Purbright asked, with his usual courtesy, who had been responsible for the arrangement of the preserves. Craggs pursed his lips. That had been Miss Empson and her helpers. They fussed around for an hour that morning, shifting jars back and forth, swapping ribbons, and rewriting labels that said it was to keep the display uniform. Myself, I kept well out of it. Women and their jams, Inspector, nothing but trouble. Purbright thanked him gravely, suppressing the smile that threatened. Trouble of precisely that kind was, after all, his profession. On his way back through the high street, he allowed himself to pause at Gedge's stationery, where the owner, a man whose spectacles magnified his eyes to the proportions of saucers, confirmed that he had sold 3 packets of identical cream-coloured labels and 1 bottle of indelible ink in the days preceding the show. To whom? The question produced only a vague shrug. Several ladies, Inspector. Preserves. Season, you see. They all want things to look proper for the judges. Can't say I noticed exactly who, but I remember one was in quite a hurry, impatient sort, tapping her umbrella on the floor. That evening, Purbright considered how trivial the matter might appear to others, a label here, a tidy script there. Yet it was in such trifles that intent most often revealed itself. Someone had taken pains to erase distinctions, to cloak identity beneath uniform neatness. Why? So that substitution would pass unremarked until the moment when a jar with altogether different contents took its place amongst harmless preserves. Sergeant Love, however, still clung to the more satisfying notion of Mrs. Withers's guilt. He argued the point again that night as the 2 men sat in the station office, the sergeant with his boots stretched towards the fire, Purbright with his hands folded placidly in his lap. It all comes back to her, sir. She's the one whose jar was switched, the one people don't like. You ask me, she put that finger in herself and then botched the business of hiding it. Purbright merely raised an eyebrow. A lady of her temperament, Sergeant, is capable of much mischief, no doubt, but her handwriting is of the large and emphatic kind, as anyone who has received one of her letters can testify. Those labels, you recall, were neat and uniform. Does that sound like Mrs. Withers's style? Love muttered something about disguises, but subsided. He was learning, slowly, that his inspector did not dismiss details lightly, however small they seemed. The next morning, Purbright made a point of visiting Mrs. Roper, the butcher's wife, whose muttered remarks at the show had been reported with relish. She received him in a parlour fragrant with the smell of pickling spice. She was a stout woman, with arms accustomed to carrying large cuts of meat, and a tongue sharpened by long practice in market-day bargaining. "I never said aught against Mrs. Withers's jam, Inspector," she insisted, before he had even taken his seat. "What I said was that it looked a bit runny, and I'll stand by that. But I never touched it, and I certainly didn't put anything nasty in it." Purbright listened courteously, asked a few gentle questions, and then remarked in passing that the labels on all the jars had looked unusually uniform. Mrs. Roper snorted. "Uniform? That's Miss Empson's doing. She's always on about presentations. She nearly snatched my jar off me, tore off my label, and stuck on one of her own, said it looked untidy, would spoil the effect. I told her she'd spoil the effect if she went on fussing like that. But you know what she's like. She always thinks she knows best." This confirmed the inspector's growing suspicion. If Miss Empson had indeed relabelled the jars, even for reasons of tidiness, then she had unwittingly, or perhaps deliberately, created the perfect chance for mischief. Yet it seemed unwise to press the point too soon. For the moment he merely thanked Mrs. Roper and left her to pick her up. By evening, Purbright's notes contained one new line underlined twice. Labels, uniform opportunity created. A trifle perhaps, but one that carried within it the seed of explanation. The finger had not appeared by magic. Someone had used the opportunity of altered labels and rearranged jars to introduce it unnoticed. That person, he reflected, must be someone both familiar with the committee's arrangements and willing to exploit them. He closed his notebook, leaned back, and allowed the faintest smile to touch his lips. In Flaxborough, it was always the trifles that told the story. Inspector Purbright was careful not to let the matter of the labels dominate his thoughts too early. He knew well that to grip too tightly at one thread might blind him to the pattern of the cloth. So he widened his circle of quiet inquiries, choosing his subjects with the patience of a man who knew the town's social lattice as thoroughly as its street map. Flaxborough was small, but every soul in it was entangled in at least 3 quarrels and 4 favours, each capable of ripening into motive. His first call that morning was to Councillor Harbottle, who received him in a study lined with the sort of heavy leather-bound books that one suspected had been chosen for spine colour rather than content. Harbottle greeted him with a flourish of authority, though a faint defensiveness clung to his manner. The councillor repeated, as if rehearsed, his conviction that Mrs. Withers had engineered the incident herself. But, as Purbright listened, his eyes rested on the councillor's desk, an open blotter, 6 envelopes addressed in a curiously tidy script, and a small bottle of ink whose shade seemed not unlike that used on the preserve labels. He made no remark, but asked instead whether Harbottle had noticed anything unusual during the judging. The councillor, puffing his chest, recalled only that Miss Empson had been extraordinarily fidgety, shifting jars and smoothing labels with what struck him as unnecessary zeal. Purbright thanked him, filed the details alongside the others, and left Harbottle basking in the belief he had assisted materially in the inquiry. From Harbottle's he strolled to the vicarage, where the Reverend Kinsey greeted him with such solemn relief one might have thought the inspector carried a direct line to Providence. The vicar spoke gravely of moral decline, of how even Marmalade could now be corrupted by ungodly influence. He did, however, let slip that his wife had been quite upset by the rumours spreading through town that the finger had come from her kitchen stores. "She is mortified, Inspector," he said, lowering his voice. "Some people even suggested she may have confused the jars when making jam for the bazaar. Quite ridiculous, of course, but you know how tongues wag." Purbright, murmuring polite sympathy, asked whether Mrs. Kinsey had been at the show. She had, it appeared, briefly stopped by to deliver a sponge cake and had lingered long enough to chat with Miss Empson about hymn selections. Nothing more incriminating than that, though the inspector noted the anxiety with which the vicar sought to deflect attention from his wife. In Flaxborough, anxiety was often the smoke from a fire of some kind, though not always the one expected. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, busied himself with inquiries among the tradesfolk. He returned with accounts that added more characters to the expanding stage. The undertaker, Mr. Greenaway, reported in his sepulchral manner that several months earlier a man of middle years had lost a finger in an accident at the brickworks, and that the surgeon had performed the amputation locally. Quite proper disposal was made of the part, he assured Love, though his tone suggested that the business of dismembered digits held little novelty for him. Love repeated this to Purbright with relish, adding, "There you are, sir. Someone's filched it from the surgery, likely Mrs. Withers." Purbright only sighed, though not unkindly. "You mustn't drag her back into everything, Sergeant. Let us keep an open mind. Even fingers deserve more than a single explanation." The brickworks led to another small avenue of speculation. A man named Ray, a fitter, had indeed lost the finger after a misadventure with a heavy chain. He was now back at work, still surly about his misfortune, and when approached by Love had reacted with irritation to any suggestion his missing finger had turned up in Marmalade. "If you found it, keep it," he growled. "It's done me no good these past months." Purbright, on hearing this, remarked mildly that such brusqueness was no certain sign of guilt. More likely, the man resented having his injury turned into village spectacle. Still, it placed a name and an accident into the inspector's notes. By the week's end, the circle of possible connections had widened considerably. There was Miss Empson with her interfering tidiness, Harbottle with his eagerness to pin blame, Mrs. Roper with her sharp tongue and dislike of Mrs. Withers, the Kinseys anxious to avoid scandal, and now the injured Ray, whose severed finger might indeed be the very one afloat in formalin at Dr. Hilliard's surgery. Each had cause, petty cause, perhaps, to want Mrs. Withers humbled, and each had opportunity in some measure. Purbright kept his demeanour mild and unreadable, but the quiet stirrings of interest came when he considered the path of the jar itself. Someone had bought labels, someone had written them in a neat, identical hand, someone had shifted jars that morning, and in the midst of this bustle, one jar had been placed that contained more than peel. A simple story, told backwards, pointed less towards Mrs. Withers and more towards someone who had hovered near the displays with apparent authority. A judge, a counsellor, a committee helper, anyone who could fuss, without suspicion. It was during this period of reflection that Purbright found himself in the Imperial Cafe once more, observing the flow of gossip like a fisherman watching the river. Miss Teatley, the retired schoolmistress, was still holding forth, but now her story had grown to include a theory that foreign agents were using marmalade jars to smuggle secrets. The inspector's attention, however, was caught not by her fancy, but by a remark from another table. A young clerk from the stationer's mentioned that one of the counsellors he thought might have been Harbottle had bought sealing wax at the same time as the labels and ink. "Odd thing, sealing wax," the clerk said. "Hardly anyone uses it now except old-fashioned types who like to impress." The inspector made no sign of interest, yet the detail nested in his mind. Sealing wax, ink, labels, an armoury of tidiness or of disguise, and all acquired just before the show. That evening, as dusk dimmed the outlines of the market square, Purbright walked slowly back to the station. He knew he had not yet reached the heart of the matter, but the field had expanded as he intended it to, until the guilty figure, whoever they were, would soon have less room in which to hide. The rhythm of Flaxborough life was not easily disturbed for long, even by the apparition of a finger in a jar of marmalade. By the following week the town had largely resumed its routines, though the matter continued to provide material for speculation in back parlours and shop queues. It might have remained little more than an anecdote, one to be remembered with relish for years to come, had it not been for the discovery made by a schoolboy named Alec Prendergast on his way home from lessons one damp Thursday afternoon. Alec, who was known chiefly for his talent in collecting things other people had discarded, was rummaging among the bins behind the assembly rooms when he found a small crate. It was not the crate itself that interested him, but the 3 empty jars inside, their gingham covers still neatly tied. Curious, he pulled one out and sniffed. What emerged was not the tang of fruit, but a faint chemical odour that made his nose wrinkle. Thinking at once of treasures, he lugged the crate home and deposited it in the scullery, where his mother, upon realizing what her son had dragged in, let out such a cry that the neighbours were soon knocking at the door. Within an hour the jars had made their way to the police station. Sergeant Love was positively gleeful when Purbright returned to find the evidence waiting on his desk. "There you are, sir. Proof. 3 more jars. Could be the rest of Mrs. Withers's batch. Look here. Same size, same clothes, same labels. And the smell Dr. Hilliard says it's formalin. That's what they pickle bits of people in, isn't it?" He leaned forward, eyes shining. This ties it all up. Whoever put the finger in had these jars ready, might have been keeping them for more grisly tricks. Purbright lifted one jar and studied it with mild curiosity. It was spotless inside, but the odour was undeniable. "Formalin," he murmured. So whoever prepared the finger also prepared jars to store it, and then abandoned them. He replaced the jar carefully. "That does not suggest Mrs. Withers to me, Sergeant. She is a woman who hoards old knitting patterns, but I doubt she hoards anatomical curiosities." Love, disappointed, muttered, "Still it could point to that Ray fellow. He had the finger to begin with, didn't he? Had it, yes. But whether he wished to keep it, and in a preserved jar, is another question entirely." Word of the discovery spread quickly, carried by Mrs. Prendergast's unrestrained retelling of her son's adventure. By the time evening fell, most of the town was convinced that the assembly rooms had been a storehouse for horrors. Some claimed a whole box of human parts had been spirited away. Others insisted the jars had originally been hidden under the very table where the preserves were judged. There was even a brief rumour that the finger had been meant as a warning to the mayor, though no one could say what he had done to deserve it. Purbright, ignoring these more flamboyant accounts, concentrated on the fact of the jars themselves. They bore labels written in the same neat script as those at the show, though left blank. That small connection tied the new discovery back to the central question of who had written the labels in the first place. And why had the crate been left behind the assembly rooms? Carelessness or haste? The inspector walked to the building the next morning when the caretaker, Mr. Craggs, was sweeping the entrance. Questioned mildly, Craggs admitted that he had noticed someone lingering behind the building late on the afternoon of the show, after most of the crowd had gone. He could not be certain who, but thought it might have been a woman because of the way she held herself, tidy and brisk-like. When pressed further, he muttered, "Could have been Miss Empson. She's always fussing about afterwards, checking doors and such." Purbright made no comment beyond his usual polite, "Thank you." But the details lingered. Miss Empson, tidy and brisk, rewriting labels, arranging jars present at every stage. It was beginning to look less like an accident and more like orchestration. Still, he was careful not to let suspicion gallop ahead of certainty. That evening he called on Dr. Hilliard again, this time to ask whether the jars had been professionally cleaned. Hilliard confirmed that the residue of formalin suggested they had been prepared with a degree of care, though not by a laboratory. Someone with a vague knowledge, he concluded, but hardly scientific rigour. An amateur, though a determined one. Meanwhile, Sergeant Love produced a fresh tidbit. One of the stationer's clerks had remembered more clearly. It had not been Harbottle, but Miss Empson herself who purchased the cream labels and indelible ink. She had also asked whether they stocked sealing wax, though in the end she had not bought any. "There you are, sir," Love exclaimed, triumphant. "It all points to her. She had the labels, she fussed with the jars, she was seen round the back of the hall. What more do you need?" Purbright, who was lighting his pipe with deliberate slowness, replied mildly, "Motive, Sergeant. One always requires that small addition. Why should Miss Empson wish to plant a finger in a jar of marmalade, and why especially to implicate Mrs. Withers?" Love opened his mouth, closed it again, and finally muttered, "Well, nobody likes Mrs. Withers." "True enough," said Purbright with a faint smile. "But dislike alone seldom inspires formalin and fresh labels. There is usually a more particular grievance." As he walked home that night across the quiet square, Purbright reflected that the second incident had done its work. It had deepened the mystery, widened the suspicion, and unsettled those who thought the scandal might fade. Someone, somewhere in Flaxborough, had gone to trouble and taken risks to keep the business alive. It was no prank gone stale, but a design not yet completed. Inspector Purbright had a habit, cultivated over years of provincial investigation, of letting events settle in his mind like silt in a glass of water. He preferred not to shake the glass unnecessarily. After the discovery of the empty jars behind the assembly rooms and the cautious identifications that seemed to nudge suspicion towards Miss Empson, he retreated into a phase of deliberate quietness. Sergeant Love, bustling with certainty, could not understand why his superior did not simply summon the lady and demand an explanation. But Purbright had learned that people, if left long enough, tended to reveal themselves with greater candor than if pressed. In his modest sitting room above the station, he sat one evening with a pipe that gave off more smoke than flame, and considered the nature of malice in small towns. Crimes in Flaxborough were rarely the thunderous eruptions found in sensational novels. They were more often slow simmerings, grudges carried through decades, affronts magnified by repetition, humiliations nursed into motives. A jar of marmalade containing a finger was on the surface grotesque, but underneath it bore the familiar stamp of local spite. Someone, very likely, had wanted to see Mrs. Withers humbled in the most dramatic fashion possible. The inspector reflected on each of the players. Harbottle, pompous and opportunistic, had leapt at the chance to discredit a tiresome adversary, yet pomp alone did not furnish fingers. The Kinseys were anxious, but anxiety was often the by-product of guilt by association, rather than the mark of perpetrators. Ray, the brickworks man, had supplied the finger unwillingly by virtue of his accident, but his resentment was aimed more at fate than at Mrs. Withers. And then there was Miss Empson, fussy, officious, with that dangerous blend of authority and zeal which turned tidy-mindedness into meddling. She had rewritten the labels, shifted the jars, and perhaps, just perhaps, possessed a grievance sharp enough to justify theatrics. Still, motive remained elusive. What had Mrs. Withers done to her? Or was the target not Mrs. Withers at all, but someone else entirely, with Mrs. Withers merely the convenient victim chosen to receive the scandal? Purbright considered this last possibility with growing interest. Flaxborough minds seldom thought in terms of broad symbolism, but they were deft at personal revenge. Had Miss Empson, or some other hand, chosen Mrs. Withers's jar, not for its quality, but for its owner's unpopularity? To set the finger afloat in jam was to set the town's tongue wagging in precisely the right direction. Purbright's musings were interrupted by Sergeant Love, who entered with the briskness of a man carrying news too heavy to sit upon. He reported that Miss Empson had been overheard in the lending library telling another patron that Mrs. Withers's preserves never amounted to much and were bound to bring her down sooner or later. Love regarded this as almost a confession. Purbright merely thanked him, though inwardly he filed it beside all the other fragments of small-town venom. What interested him was less the statement itself than the eagerness with which it was reported to him by others. The town wanted to see Miss Empson as guilty now, just as it had wanted to see Mrs. Withers guilty before. Flaxborough liked its scapegoats. The inspector took a walk that evening through the narrow streets, hands in his coat pockets, pipe stem jutting like a punctuation mark of thought. He passed curtained windows, through which lights spilled onto damp pavement, each house a small capsule of gossip and grievance. He could imagine the conversations, husbands scoffing, wives whispering, children speculating with relish. The crime had become less a mystery to them than a form of entertainment. That, too, was a clue. Someone in town was enjoying the drama not as spectator but as conductor, stirring the talk, feeding it with little nudges, ensuring the spectacle did not fade. That persistence of mischief betrayed a temperament as much as any fingerprint might. Returning to his rooms, Purbright wrote a single line in his notebook. "The guilty party enjoys the play more than the outcome." He underlined it, then closed the book. He knew that the next step would not be to accuse, but to watch, to provide opportunity for the culprit to act again or to betray themselves under a well-placed question. Over the next few days he adopted a manner of apparent idleness, attending civic functions with his usual mild smile, listening far more than he spoke. He noted how Miss Empson, though indignant at whispers, seemed oddly energized by the attention, speaking often and with relish about her role as judge. He saw how Harbottle, sensing suspicion drifting away from Mrs. Withers, redoubled his efforts to redirect blame, lest he lose political advantage. He observed Mrs. Roper muttering about proper butchers' wives not wasting time on jam, though she too repeated the tale with suspicious frequency. All enjoyed the scandal, but some enjoyed it as a stage on which to perform. Purbright sat with these reflections like a gardener waiting for the frost to lift. He knew that in Flaxborough the truth was less often uncovered than coaxed to the surface by patience, and he sensed that the moment was near when a polite word, placed in the right ear, would bring the guilty one tumbling out of their own contrivance. Until then, he would let the town chatter itself hoarse and listen carefully to the silences between its words. Inspector Purbright had reached that stage in an investigation where certainty still lay at a distance, but the outlines of it were beginning to form in the mist. His reflections of the past week had convinced him of two things. First, that Mrs. Withers, despite being convenient to blame, had no hand in the matter beyond being its chosen target, and second, that the person responsible was someone who had taken as much satisfaction in the uproar as in the deed itself. Such a temperament, Purbright thought, would not resist a chance to assert superiority once more, particularly if given the proper stage. It was time, therefore, for a test. The occasion presented itself in the form of a small committee gathering at the town hall to discuss next year's civic entertainments. Purbright arranged, with the mayor's cooperation, to attend in a nominal capacity, though it was widely assumed that his presence was intended to reassure the townsfolk that the matter of the marmalade jar had not been dropped. Councillor Harbottle was there, blustering and pompous. Mrs. Roper, invited on account of her role in the produce competitions, the Reverend Kinsey, his expression suitably grave, and of course Miss Empson, who took her seat with a prim air of authority. The meeting was routine until Purbright, with his customary mild tone, raised a seemingly innocent query. "I wonder," he began, smoothing a page of notes before him, "whether in future years it might be wise to insist that exhibitors affixed their own labels firmly to their jars, and that no relabelling be permitted by the committee. After all, one never knows what mischief might creep in when labels are altered." A small silence followed. Harbottle coughed. Mrs. Roper gave a short laugh and muttered that tidiness was well and good, but it had its dangers. The Reverend nodded sagely, but it was Miss Empson whose reaction Purbright watched most closely. She drew herself up, colour rising in her cheeks, and declared sharply, "Are you suggesting, Inspector, that my efforts to present the exhibits decently were improper? It would have been chaos if I had not taken matters in hand. Without me the preserves table would have looked like a jumble sale." Her voice, normally quavery, was sharpened with indignation. Purbright inclined his head gently. "Of course, Miss Empson, no one doubts your devotion to order, but the very efficiency with which the labels were made uniform did make substitution remarkably easy." He allowed the words to linger, then returned his gaze to his notes as though the matter were of no consequence. The silence this time was heavier, charged. Harbottle shifted uneasily. Mrs. Roper raised her brows. and Miss Empson, though she pressed her lips together, could not resist adding in a lower, tauter tone, "Well, if some people had not been forever pushing themselves forward with their preserves, there would have been no motive for anyone to tamper." That, Purbright thought, was the slip he had waited for. She had not been accused, yet she had spoken of motive with an eagerness that betrayed her own line of thought. He said nothing further, merely let the remark hang in the stale air of the committee room. To the others it might have seemed no more than another of her scolds, but to Purbright it revealed the central knot of envy and resentment that had driven her fussing hand. After the meeting dispersed, Sergeant Love cornered him outside, bursting with excitement. "You saw her, sir." Nears admitted it. "Why don't we take her in?" Purbright shook his head. "Not yet, Sergeant. Admission born of pique is not proof. Let us give her a little more room. People who cannot resist fussing also cannot resist speaking, and speech, in time, becomes evidence." He returned to his rooms that evening with the quiet satisfaction of a gardener who had tested the soil and found it fertile. The seeds of guilt were there. It remained only to let them grow into something harvestable. He poured himself a modest glass of beer, set aside his pipe, and considered how best to draw out the final confession. It would not be by confrontation, nor by threat, but by that most ordinary of Flaxborough tools, conversation at the right moment, offered with the right courtesy. For the next 2 days he allowed matters to proceed naturally. The town continued its chatter, increasingly directed at Miss Empson, though still without certainty. He paid her a courtesy visit under the guise of checking her statement once more. She received him stiffly, seated among doilies and a stiff-backed sofa, and insisted that she had acted only out of duty. Yet Purbright, steering the talk with apparent aimlessness, led her to speak at length of Mrs. Withers's faults. "So domineering, Inspector, always presuming she knows better. I dare say she deserved to be shown up. Not that I had any part in it, of course, but people must see she's not the paragon she pretends." Purbright nodded gravely, thanked her for her time, and left her with the impression that she had once more defended herself admirably. But he wrote in his notebook a single line. "She cannot stop pressing the point. She wants Withers humbled, even now." It was less confession than compulsion, and compulsion, he knew, would soon be her undoing. The slow, steady pressure of gossip in Flaxborough had by now turned Miss Empson into a figure both pitied and suspected. It was not that anyone could quite imagine her trafficking in severed digits, but that she had been so zealously at the centre of the show, rewriting labels and straightening jars, that people found it difficult to exclude her. Every day, in the Imperial Cafe or in the queue at the grocer's, someone would murmur that she knows more than she lets on. This whispering chorus was, in its way, as damaging as accusation, and Purbright, though never one to court cruelty, knew it was softening her resistance. When a person is pushed by their neighbours into the role of suspect, they begin to betray themselves in anxious protests. He decided it was time to draw the matter towards its conclusion, though still with the patience that had carried him this far. He began by revisiting small corners of the inquiry that seemed outwardly trivial, but which, combined, would form the threads of a noose. At the brickworks he again questioned Ray, the man who had lost the finger. Ray remained sour, but his irritation rang with the note of someone who wished only to be left out of a drama. "I didn't pickle it, I didn't keep it, and I don't care who did," he snapped. Purbright believed him. The man's concern was his wages and his injury pension. He had neither wit nor inclination to meddle in Marmalade. From there, Purbright returned to the stationer's shop, where he inquired once more about the purchases of labels and ink. This time, the owner, encouraged by the inspector's mild persistence, recalled clearly that Miss Empson had requested the neatest script labels they had. Said she wanted all the jars looking proper for the judges, he explained. She was very particular, asked about sealing wax too, though we didn't have the colour she wanted. Purbright thanked him and left, the evidence in his mind sharpening into focus. Labels, ink, empty jars, and the relish of one woman who could not abide disorder, and perhaps could not abide Mrs. Withers. Back at the station, Sergeant Love could no longer contain himself. "It's as plain as the nose on your face, sir. She's done it. She wanted to bring Mrs. Withers low, and what better way than to turn the whole town against her jam?" He beamed at his own reasoning, but Purbright shook his head slightly. "Not plain, Sergeant. Not yet. Motive must be clear, not assumed. People rarely risk scandal for the sake of tidiness alone." Love groaned. "But what if we lose our chance, sir?" "She could cover her tracks." "On the contrary," said Purbright gently, "she has already left them. The trick is to arrange matters so that she betrays herself without knowing she has done so." That chance came sooner than expected. The mayor, anxious to reassert civic dignity, decided to host a small gathering in the assembly rooms to demonstrate that the building had not been tainted by scandal. Purbright suggested almost idly that the occasion might feature a modest exhibition of preserves and cakes from local ladies to remind the town of happier traditions. The mayor, who liked the sound of anything that reassured constituents, agreed at once. Invitations went out, and within days the tables of the assembly rooms once more bore jars and confections, though this time watched with unusual vigilance. Purbright strolled among the displays with quiet courtesy, nodding at Mrs. Roper's pickles, murmuring admiration for Mrs. Kinsey's sponge, and pausing before a row of marmalade jars. Miss Empson, bustling as ever, hovered nearby, straightening ribbons, fussing over the arrangement. It was then that Purbright made his move, leaning close as though in private confidence. "It would be a terrible thing, Miss Empson, if some mischievous person took advantage of your careful labelling again. One never knows when such a substitution might happen." The effect was immediate and revealing. She flushed, her hands tightening on the jar she was holding. "It was not my fault last time," she exclaimed sharply. "How did I know what was in it? I only wanted things to look decent." The nearby ladies glanced round at her raised tone, and she faltered, attempting to smooth her outburst into a calmer explanation. But the damage was done. In her eagerness to defend herself, she had placed herself squarely at the heart of the substitution, admitting knowledge she need not have acknowledged at all. Later, back at the station, Purbright recorded the incident in his notes with quiet satisfaction. To any outsider, it was a trifle a woman's defensiveness, nothing more. But to him it was the pattern of guilt, the compulsion to justify, the eagerness to control appearances, the inability to let the matter rest. He could now see clearly how the crime had unfolded, the labels purchased, the jars cleaned and scented with formalin, the substitution made under the guise of tidying. It did not require strength, only proximity and authority. And Miss Empson had both in abundance. Still, he reminded himself the task was not yet complete. A public revelation required every thread to be tied neatly. He needed motive spelled out, opportunity explained, and the web of small resentments clarified into one plain, undeniable truth. That truth was close now, like the spire glimpsed through fog. One more conversation, one more push, and the mist would clear. The mayor's idea of convening a gathering of reassurance at the town hall provided Inspector Purbright with the precise stage he needed. Invitations had gone to councillors, clergy, and the more prominent tradesfolk. By the appointed evening, the assembly rooms were filled with a buzz of voices, the scent of sponge and sherry, and the slightly brittle laughter of people anxious to show they were untroubled by scandal. The tables were arrayed with polite abundance, cakes in regimented ranks, jams gleaming beneath cloth caps, and several jars of marmalade that were eyed with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Purbright, moving with his usual unhurried grace, allowed the company to chatter and settle, then at length raised his mild voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may beg your attention for a few moments." The hum faded, leaving the clink of a spoon hastily set down. He stood before the very table of preserves, hands lightly clasped, and addressed the gathering in the same courteous manner he might have used to announce the discovery of a lost umbrella. "I believe it may be useful to you all if I explain what we have learned regarding the unfortunate incident at the flower show. It was, I assure you, no prank of foreign agents, no outbreak of witchcraft, nor even the handiwork of poor Mrs. Withers herself. The truth, as is so often the case, is at once simpler and more human." His eyes passed gently over the room, observing the little stirrings. Mrs. Withers, stiff with anticipation, Harbottle striving for an expression of judicious interest, and Miss Empson sitting bolt upright, her fingers clenched on her handbag. He went on, unhurried. The finger found in that jar was not fresh. It was a surgical specimen, preserved in formalin. That in itself told us much. It meant that the affair was planned, not improvised. Someone had kept the finger for weeks, perhaps months, until a moment arrived when its use would make the greatest impact. The flower show, with its crowd of townsfolk and its element of competition, provided the perfect theatre. A murmur passed through the audience, as though they were listening to a recital rather than an investigation. Purbright continued, "Now, one must ask, who had both the opportunity and the inclination to place such an object among the preserves? The exhibitors themselves were preoccupied with their entries, the public crowded too thickly to act without notice. But there was one figure who moved freely among the jars, rearranging them, relabeling them, ensuring that all looked tidy." He paused, long enough for the silence to swell. That person was Miss Empson. The room shifted uneasily. Miss Empson gave a small, strangled protest. "Inspector, I merely sought to bring order. The labels were untidy, surely you cannot—" But Purbright lifted a hand with grave courtesy. "No one doubts your zeal for neatness, madam, but zeal, when combined with resentment, can be a dangerous mixture. You yourself spoke often of Mrs. Withers's overbearing ways, her presumption to dictate in parish matters. You found her, by your own account, tiresome and in need of humbling. You alone had purchased the labels and ink. You alone were seen behind the assembly rooms where the empty jars were left, and you alone could have made the substitution appear innocent. It was not murder you committed, but a cruelty of another sort, the deliberate attempt to humiliate a neighbour through a grotesque spectacle. There was a stir of whispers, some shocked, some grimly satisfied. Mrs. Withers, her face a mixture of triumph and outrage, opened her mouth as if to speak, but Purbright continued smoothly, sparing the gathering the prospect of her victory speech. "The matter will be dealt with in the proper manner, of course. But I ask you to remember, crime in Flaxborough is seldom the work of monsters. More often it is the fruit of our own small envies and grievances, tended until they bear something poisonous, in this case a finger in a jar of marmalade." Miss Empson gave no further protest. She sat rigid, lips pressed, as if her whole being were concentrated on preserving the last shred of dignity. The mayor, red with discomfort, muttered something about a shocking breach of civic trust. Harbottle leaned to whisper to his neighbour, already plotting how to use the scandal for his advantage. And Mrs. Withers dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, secure at last in her vindication. Later, when the gathering had broken up into clumps of excited conversation, Purbright slipped away quietly. He walked back to the police station under the lamps that glowed along the high street, his expression unreadable, his pace unhurried. At his desk he set down his notebook and allowed himself a moment of reflection. The business had been absurd in its form, grotesque in its detail, yet at heart so very ordinary, one woman's envy, another's vanity, a town's appetite for scandal. These were the true constants of Flaxborough life, and they would supply work for the police long after the marmalade jar was forgotten. By the next morning, the town had already begun its return to routine. At the post office, the talk was of postal delays; at the market, of the price of eggs. Yet beneath it all there lingered the aftertaste of the affair, a sharper awareness of how fragile reputations could be and how quickly neighbours might become accusers. Mrs. Withers walked with a new hauteur down High Street, and Miss Empson, though still at liberty, withdrew from society with a stiffness that was itself a form of defeat. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, attended to paperwork, his pen scratching steadily across reports. He asked Sergeant Love to draft a note to the county authorities, and then returned to a stack of routine correspondence. To all appearances, the case had left him unmoved, but in the quiet of his office, as he reached for another file, a faint smile touched his lips. In Flaxborough, he reflected, life would always provide another jar, another finger, another small drama dressed up as a scandal. It was his role simply to observe, to untangle, and to return order with as little fuss as possible.